What could possibly a child cannibal serial killer, a BDSM comic from the creator of Superman, and the Comics Code Authority all have in common? One man named Fredrick Wertham, a famed psychiatrist and author whose time testifying in the horrifying child killer Albert Fish trial led him on a crusade against violence, sex, and drugs in comic books of the 1950s. His efforts to ban and censor comics would become so severe that it would lead to the death of the top comic artists of the day and the demise of his career. It all goes back to one of Wertham's highest profile cases, working as an expert witness on the Albert Fish trial. Albert Fish was a notorious serial killer who cannibalized his child victims. Wertham was brought on trial by the defense to prove that Fish was clinically insane and have his death penalty tossed out. The jury agreed he was insane but felt his crimes were so heinous that they gave him the death penalty anyways. After the case, Wertham opened his own practice which focused on troubled youth. He quickly developed new theories around the influence of culture and the environment on criminal behavior, resulting in the book Dark Legend in 1941. This was a true story of a 17-year-old who killed his mother. Dr. Wertham noted how the boy lived in a fantasy world influenced by movies, the radio, comic books. This was the first time Wertham linked comics to crime, and in his following work, he would bring this theory full circle. He would point to the horror and fantasy publisher EC Comics as a perfect example of how violent and extreme imagery were psychologically altering child readers' minds. He felt comics were especially dangerous because they had no censorship and the artists were allowed the creative freedom to write and draw whatever they pleased, unlike the movies and TV, which had to abide by the Hays Code. In 1948, Dr. Wertham released his first article condemning comics because of their effects on children's minds in the Saturday Review of Literature. He stated that the crime and violence depicted in comics were an important factor in leading kids down the criminal path. One of the comics he used was Jack Cole's classic story from True Crimes 2, the story that depicts a girl about to get her eye poked out with a hypodermic needle in the story called Murder, Morphine, and Me. That comic became instrumental and example in Dr. Wertham's crusade against comics. The pages even appeared in an investigation conducted by the New York State government to study the publications of comics. Then in November of 1953, Dr. Wertham published an article in one of the most popular magazines of the time, the Ladies' Home Journal. This was another anti-comics article, which was the direct plea to mothers across the United States to prevent their children from reading comics. He even went as far to call for the outright extinction of comic books. Soon after the article was published, parents began gathering up children's comic books and burning them or disposing them in some way. But this was only the beginning of Dr. Wertham's crusade against comics. Soon he would publish his biggest attack yet. He published a book that grabbed Americans' attention and nearly doomed the entire comic industry. It all happened in April of 1954 when he published his book titled Seduction of the Innocence. The novel warned that comic books were a negative form of popular literature and a serious cause of juvenile delinquency. It had many claims about how bad comics were for the youth of the time. Not only did it say that there was too much violence and sex and drug use and adult content within crime and horror, but Dr. Wertham also went after the superhero genre as well. He claimed that Batman comics promoted pedophilia, homosexuality, because Batman would take a child, Robin, as his gay lover. He also believed that comic art was filled with submersive imagery which was driving children to become more hardened criminals. During this time, homosexuality was viewed as a mental disorder by society. He went on to claim that Wonder Woman had bondage subtext, which ultimately turned out to be true, as the creator William Martson later admitted. However, Dr. Wertham also claimed Wonder Woman's strength and independence made her a lesbian, and that all Wonder Woman comics were promoting lesbianism. Superman wasn't out of the crosshairs either. He claimed Superman was un-American and a fascist. Needless to say, most of his claims were not based on facts, but rather just to push his agenda to getting comics banned. Needless to say, most of the claims weren't based on facts at all, and they were just trying to push his agenda to get comic books banned. The same summer of 1954, Dr. Wertham was brought into another high-profile murder case in which comics were linked to the crime. It was the case of the Brooklyn Thrill Killers. A gang of 4 teenagers believed they would quote-unquote cleanse the streets of Brooklyn by acting as vigilante heroes like in the comics. They took it upon themselves to do all the beating up, pouring gasoline on people, and lighting them on fire. The first person they murdered was a homeless alcoholic that they beat to death. Next, they found a black man passed out on the park bench. They beat him up, proceeded to drown him in the East River. This trial attracted considerable media attention and only further pushed Wertham's theory that comics were destroying the minds of the American youth. As the court psychiatrist, Dr. Wertham testified that it was reading comics which led to the kids to commit the murders. Ultimately, one admitted to reading an adult comic titled Nights of Terror, which would depict BDSM, torture, and sexual slavery. This was the very same comic happened to be drawn by one of the creators of Superman, Joe Shuster. At the time, Shuster was nearly blind and penniless from DC having taken the rights of Superman from him. The creators tried to sue DC to win the rights back in 1948, but they lost. Shuster tried to create a new character named Funny Man, but the series failed only after 3 issues. With no other way of income, he took the job of illustrating this comic book for his neighbor. He was embarrassed to do it, but needed the money, so he left his name out of the comic, hoping no one would ever find out it was him. But his unique art style gave it away. The public were outraged at this comic book that they believed drove the teenagers to commit this horrendous act. The Nights of Horror was banned by the state of New York. They tried to appeal it and even went to the Supreme Court, where they upheld the ban in 1957. After the book came out, Dr. Wertham appeared before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. There he claimed that the comic book industry was more dangerous for children than Hitler ever was. Yes, Hitler, the man responsible for World War II, the Holocaust, killing millions of people. The entire hearing was broadcast on television and also made headlines across the front page of newspapers everywhere. Publisher William Gaines of EC Comics testified in the defense of the comic book industry. He claimed that the horror and crime comics were in good taste. A senator named Herbert Beeser then held up Crime Suspense Stories number 22, which depicted a woman's head being chopped off, and asked if this was in good taste. Listeners across the country were shocked by the following dialogue between Beezer and Gaines. The senator asked, "Then you think a child cannot in any way, shape, or manner be hurt by anything that a child reads or sees?" Gaines responded, "I do not believe so." Then Senator Kiefer said, "Here in your May issue, this seems to be a man with a bloody axe, holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. Do you think that's in good taste?" Then Gaines replied, "Yes, sir, I do, for the cover of the horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so the blood could be seen dripping from it, and moving the body a little further over so the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody." At this point, the damage had been done, and the public was outraged. They actually begun large comic book burnings in towns across the nation. Almost overnight, the hearings drew fear for the comic industry, who felt the government would pass new legislation to censor their work. That's when they decided they needed to work together. Comic book publishers formed their own censorship group in hopes of getting ahead of deterring the government from using too far-reaching laws. They decided to create the Comics Code Authority. Nearly every single publisher adhered to the code, as most distributors actually refused to carry any comics that did not carry the seal of approval. However, 2 major publishers, Dell Comics and Gold Key Comics, did not display the seal because their output was subject to a higher authority, which included Walt Disney and the producers of many TV shows aimed at children. The code was very strict, and while some comics thrived under this rule, many comic publishers ultimately went out of business. The code had very strict and unusual guidelines. For example, in all instances, good must triumph over evil. Not only that, but all graphic depictions of violence, gore, sexual innuendos that were in horror and crime comics, they were just outright banned. Policemen, judges, government officials weren't allowed to be presented in a way that shows disrespect for the established authority. No comic magazine was permitted to use the words horror or terror in its title. Females were to be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Also, zombies, torture, vampires, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism were banned. Any scene that was sexualized in any way other than emphasizing the sanctity of marriage was just outright banned. There are many other guidelines, but basically comics would now have to become equivalent to G-rated movies. EC Comics, which was extremely popular at the time, had to cancel all of its best-selling titles. Crime Suspense Stories, The Vault of Horror, and Tales from the Crypt. These restrictions, as well as banning vampires, werewolves, and zombies, helped make EC become unprofitable. All the titles except for Mad were canceled in the year following the code's introduction, and attempts by EC to launch code-friendly replacement titles were unsuccessful. Mad itself survived only because Gaines had converted the publication to a magazine format to which the code did not apply. With so many publications now struggling due to dropping sales, job opportunities for comic book creators began to dwindle. Even great artists like Jack Cole, the creator of Plastic Man, had found recent success in crime and horror comics of the time. In 1954, when the code came about, he left the comic industry completely as he could no longer draw what he wanted and felt ashamed by how the hearings deemed his work to be in bad taste. After leaving the comic industry, he went and worked for Playboy, drawing their cartoons starting with issue 5. Then in 1958, he purchased a rifle and fatally shot himself in the head. He left a note to Hugh Hefner saying that his suicide had nothing to do with him and he just couldn't go on living anymore. Some say that the witch hunt that Dr. Wertham pursued against comics and his works of art were what caused his ultimate demise. The code was stringent, and every publisher would have to submit their comic to the code before getting approval. If the code found something they disagreed with, they would send it back to the publisher and tell them to change it. Once the code was enforced, you could see a massive change sweeping across the comic landscape. Crime and horror comics that were once dominating were gone. Superheroes became campier and more kid-friendly versions of themselves, while many of the raunchier superheroes were phased out. Romance comics actually started to dominate during this time. The code was revised in 1971, allowing for more criminal activities such as killing law enforcement. They also allowed vampires, werewolves, and ghouls. That is why we got Tomb of Dracula or Werewolf by Night during this time, or how they brought back Wonder Man from the dead. Stan Lee even wrote a story dealing with drugs in Spider-Man 96 through 98, a story about how Peter Parker had to deal with his best friend Harry Osborn's drug problem and his eventual overdose. The code didn't approve these comics, but Stan Lee didn't care and published them anyways as he thought it was a story worth telling. DC head Carmen Infantino criticized Marvel for defying the code and stated that DC will never do any drug story unless the code changes. After that, the code decided to revise itself once again and then allow drug use as long as it was presented as a vicious habit. Then DC broached the topic of drug use with the Comics Code approval in Green Lantern 85 and 86, depicting Speedy as a heroin addict on the cover. As time went on, the code continued to be revised with looser and looser guidelines. By the 2000s, advertisers no longer made decisions to advertise based on the appearance of the stamp, which dramatically changed the comic landscape once again. Newer publishers emerging during this time did not even join the Comics Code Authority, regardless of whether their content conformed to their standards. DC Comics, Marvel Comics, and other Comics Code sponsors began publishing comics intended for adult audience, without the Comics Code seal. They just labeled the comics for mature readers under imprints such as DC's Vertigo and Marvel's Epic Comics. In 2001, the Comics Code Authority rejected an issue of X-Force and asked them to change a few things. Marvel instead just said no and then stopped submitting to them altogether and implemented their own kind of rating system. Then by 2010, only 3 major publishers still adhered to the code: DC Comics, Archie Comics, and Bongo Comics. DC and Archie were the last to leave in January 2011, which was the end of the Comics Code Authority and hasn't been used since then. After his minor bestseller, The Seduction of the Innocent, Dr. Wertham continued his crusade against comics. But the books he continued to release on the subject grew less and less impactful as time passed. In fact, Wertham was invited to speak at the New York Comic Art Convention after publishing his book in 1974, The World of Fanzines. However, he was greeted with suspicion and heckling from the crowd and left earlier than planned, after which he not only refused to write about comics, but he never actually published another book on the subject again. Wertham died in 1981 at the age of 86. Many accuse his infamous book as inaccurate and claim that he falsified data to fit his agenda, but in the end, his agenda worked and comics were changed forever, with some even being canceled permanently.